Welcome to The World Today, a program at Perry Worldhouse, the University of Pennsylvania's global affairs think tank. I hope everyone is safe and healthy during these unprecedented times. I'm Michael Horowitz, Richard Perry Professor and Director of Perry Worldhouse. Today's guest is Michael Carpenter, who's also Managing Director of the Penn Biden Center for Diplomacy and Global Engagement at the University of Pennsylvania and our co-sponsor on this event. In addition to being Managing Director of the Penn Biden Center, Dr. Carpenter is a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. He served in the Pentagon as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense with responsibility for Russia, Ukraine, Eurasia, the Balkans, and conventional arms control. He served in the White House as a foreign policy advisor to Vice President Biden, as well as on the National Security Council as a director for Russia. Point being, he knows a lot about what we're going to talk about. Dr. Carpenter, thank you for joining us today at Perry Worldhouse, and let me turn the floor over to you to give us some introductory thoughts about the state of U.S.-Russian relations, bounties, and what the heck is going on.
Great, thanks, Mike. Appreciate that, and it's a pleasure to co-host this event with Perry Worldhouse. For those of you out there who first heard the news about Russians placing bounties on American lives in Afghanistan, I think a lot of people heard that news and were genuinely shocked that something like this could be happening right now. And I think they should be shocked. And here's why. First of all, this represents a major escalation over what the Russian GRU and what the Russian military was doing in Afghanistan heretofore. So this takes things across a sort of a qualitative Rubicon, if you will, from providing arms to the Taliban and perhaps covertly to other extremist groups like the Hekmatyar militia, to actually targeting American and NATO troops. Second, it's concerning because the room now for miscalculation on both sides is enormous in terms of the potential for the Russian side to misread the lack of action from the Trump White House, and the Trump White House with a potentially unpredicted and unpredictable response coming on the heels of a popular outcry that this is now happening. The third thing here, though, is to note that in some ways, while shocking and abhorrent and appalling, and you can pick your adverb, this is in some ways not entirely unsurprising, because this escalation, although it is an escalation, it represents a continuation of what I have referred to as the Kremlin's war on Western democracies. And I use the term war advisedly. I know a lot of people hear that word and they think perhaps it's hyperbole, it's exaggerated for dramatic effect. But those of us who have worked in the Pentagon or the CIA or the State Department, we've seen over the course of at least the last 7 or 8 years, a gradual escalation of Russia's attempts to undermine the US in every domain where Russia thinks it has an asymmetric advantage. And so this war is not always or usually a kinetic war. These bounties represent a sort of a kinetic escalation, which is why I think they're so dangerous. But this war has been going on for some time. You could say it more or less, it started, it's very hard to pinpoint the origins at a specific point in time, but you can say more or less it started with Putin's return to power in 2012. After a series of very strong protests against his rule, against the maneuver to put Dmitry Medvedev in the Kremlin, and for Putin to continue ruling from behind the scenes as not really from behind the scenes, but from the side, if you will, as prime minister. And it has escalated continuously since then. Don't forget that this same GRU, Russian military intelligence unit that was responsible for placing these bounties on American lives. And I'm treating this intelligence now as if it were fact. And of course, it is not 100% confirmed. If the media reports are to believe, the intelligence community has medium confidence in these reports. But all the information that I have seen and the fact that the intelligence community has medium confidence suggests that this is real, and we don't have perhaps the level of proof that would be required in the International Criminal Court or a legal body of that sort, but we have enough evidence to know that this is likely going on. And so, you know, this same, as I was saying before, the same GR unit that has paid for these bounties on American lives is the same unit that tried to organize a coup d'etat in the tiny state of Montenegro in the Balkans, where the goal was to use right-wing mercenaries to assassinate the sitting prime minister of that country. Now, the coup never got carried out because there was an insider informant who turned state witness, and so the whole thing was rolled up by the Montenegrin security services well before election day in 2016 in Montenegro. But think about that for a second. We're talking about an attempt to assassinate a sitting prime minister in a democratic country. And it's the same unit that is responsible for hacking into the Wi-Fi connections of the World Anti-Doping Agency, the same unit that is responsible for the attempted assassination of Sergei Skripal in the UK, using not just a chemical nerve agent, but a very high dose of this Novichok agent that, had it contaminated the surrounding areas, could have led to the deaths of dozens, if not hundreds, of innocent UK citizens. So what I see in this latest news about Russian bounties is a gradual escalation of a trend that had been going on for some time, but that is particularly dangerous because, as I said, it crosses a sort of a qualitative threshold. And by that, let me explain a little bit what I mean. So I testified a year ago in June of 2019 to the Congressional Helsinki Commission that the Russian security services were providing weapons and night vision equipment to the Taliban and its allies in an attempt to target US and NATO service members. And the second half of that sentence is significant because I didn't say that lightly. I didn't say they were just providing weapons to the Taliban, which we had known about for several years from General Nicholson and others. And providing weapons is bad enough, but the Russians do this in many different contexts, and frankly, many nation states around the world provide weapons to combatants in various civil wars and conflicts around the world where they have skin in the game. It's not uncommon. Russia has been doing it in Syria since the very beginning of the civil war. They've been doing it in Libya for many years now. They've provided weapons likely to Venezuela, to Iran, to many other countries. And so this was serious, what they were doing in Afghanistan by providing weapons to the Taliban. But initially, these were just sort of excess AK-47s, weapons that are ubiquitous around the world and used in conflicts everywhere. They supplemented those weapons with night vision equipment. And I mention this specifically because night vision equipment is, it's not lethal. Sorry?
Yeah, it's no joke.
It's no joke. It's not lethal equipment, so it's not a weapon. But first of all, it's in short supply in Russia. And second of all, think about why would the Russians provide the Taliban with night vision equipment? Well, it could be, you could make an argument, sure, that it could be used to target ISIS, but most likely it was used to target US forces or NATO forces, because US special operations in Afghanistan and elsewhere have always owned the night. And by providing this sort of equipment, the Russians were most likely trying to equalize the gap between the US forces and the Taliban. And now by providing bounties, they go a step further, because with bounties, there is no plausible deniability that, well, this was just intended to change the correlation of forces on the ground. It was used for counter ISIS. No, this is targeting America directly and very explicitly. And so it is very reckless, it is dangerous, and now it opens up a whole can of worms and the potential, importantly, for miscalculation by both sides going forward. And so that's why I think this is such an incredibly dangerous moment.
Whew. That's a lot to chew on, and in some ways you already answered the first question I was going to ask you, which was how new is this? So let me actually skip to something that you said. And you were quoted in Defense One about great power competition. This takes a step back a little bit from Russia in particular. And you said that you think the gap between the rhetoric of the Trump national security strategy and the practice of the administration is enormous. Is this an example of that? And how does that play in thinking about what is the gap between rhetoric and action look like on Russia, and is the emerging administration response to this an example of that?
Absolutely. So the gap or the diametrically opposed premises of the Trump national security strategy, which if you read it, is all about countering authoritarian powers like Russia and China and contesting their expanded influence around the globe. The gap between that and then the actual practice of turning a blind eye to the Kremlin placing bounties on the lives of American soldiers engaged in peacekeeping in a foreign country it's just so irreconcilable. As I said, it's diametrically opposed. And you see this time and again, however, when it comes to the Trump administration's position, especially on Russia. We could talk about China another time. This hour, I think, is devoted to Russia, so we'll talk about Russia. But from Trump's refusal to acknowledge the interference in our own democratic institutions, to calling Putin a terrific guy, to making a move early in the administration to try to lift sanctions on Russia, squashed by Congress with the passage of legislation that codified those sanctions into law, to, again, this pattern in Afghanistan of ignoring Russia's escalatory moves. All of this exposes this huge sort of cognitive space between where we say we are in terms of strategy documents and the rhetoric of mid-level and even senior officials like Secretary of State Pompeo, and then the practice and let me dwell on the practice, because the practice of not doing anything invites further aggression. And if there's anything we've learned from the Kremlin's approach to conflicts and hostility and covert operations active measures over the last 4, 5, 6, 7 years, it's that the Kremlin can be reckless at times, but they tend to pause after they take a move and survey how the international community reacts and how their target reacts. If there is no real blowback, they keep moving forward. And so that's what we've seen ever since the invasion of Ukraine in 2014. A series of steps that continue to escalate around the world. I mean, just think about the assassinations attempted in the UK and Germany just in the last couple of years, in the heart of NATO territory. And now this. So very dangerous for the Trump administration not to take action. It invites further steps by the Russian side.
So I want to pick up on one of the pieces of your response where you talked about Russia sort of pushing until it meets resistance, because in some ways that reminds me of descriptions of Stalin's foreign policy at the very beginning of the Cold War. So how are as an expert on Russia and Russian foreign policy, how are you thinking about Putin and what Putin is seeking to get out of this? Is his goal here just to sow chaos? Is his, what does Putin get? So let's presume the intelligence is true. What does Putin get out of these bounties?
A number of things. So first of all, as I said at the outset, Russia is engaged in a covert war against Western democracies, with the U.S. as the chief geopolitical adversary or enemy, if you wish. And so goal number one is to take the U.S. down a few notches, hurt the U.S., weaken the U.S., undermine our resolve to the mission in Afghanistan. Number two, it is to create a hedge in case the Taliban comes back to power. So work with the Taliban, knowing that they're on the ascendancy, and if they come back to power in Afghanistan, Russia will have been seen as helping them for many years now, and will have an in with the new Afghan government. Number three, Russia wants to be, wherever it sort of pursues these chaos strategies or destructive strategies, Russia wants to set itself up as the chief power broker, whether that's in the Middle East with its intervention in Syria, whether it's in North Africa and the Mediterranean with its intervention in Libya, in Venezuela, wherever. The Kremlin wants to displace the US as the chief power negotiating outcomes and to which regional powers come to seek an accommodation or an alignment of interests, and have those powers traveling to Moscow instead. And you're starting to see that now, at least maybe not with Afghanistan, although the Russians have tried to convene a number of meetings on Afghanistan, but you're seeing it in the Middle East where the Jordanians, the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Qataris are all traveling to Moscow to see what Moscow says about what happens next in Syria. Even the Turks, who are opposed to, in fact, fighting a proxy war with Russia in Syria, are traveling to Moscow to meet with Putin and to decide the fate of the region. They are no longer factoring in the United States as much as they did in the past, and that is a key Russian accomplishment.
So here's a question about that actually building on where you ended and talking about, say, the Turks going to Moscow. If this is really a war on Western democracies in some ways, as you described in your opening remarks, if there's this mounting evidence about Russian interference around the world, what should the collective response be? What would you were in the Obama administration, obviously, and so got to take a hand in helping shape American foreign policy toward Russia. But so given your experience and perspective, what do you think the collective response of the United States and the West should be to this Russian activity?
So I think the response has to be tailored to the activity, and we shouldn't necessarily treat every single Russian action the same way and follow the same response pattern. So Russia's cyber operations are one thing. It's attempted, the Kremlin or GRU's attempted assassinations of political figures in Berlin or UK are another thing. And these bounties are a third thing. So each one requires a tailored response, but there have to be costs and consequences imposed, as I said earlier, or the activity doesn't stop. In this particular case, assuming that initially the intelligence may have been a little bit murky, the minimum, the absolute bare minimum that the Trump administration should have done is immediately gotten on the phone with Putin. Because there is a question here about whether this activity, and I suspect this activity was directed from the very top, but we don't know that for a fact. And it could have been that there were renegade GRU officers in Afghanistan that were mounting these operations thinking that surely they were in keeping with the Kremlin's doctrine in the region, with its prescriptions, but perhaps they didn't get the official green light. I suspect that's not true. I suspect this was green lighted from the very top. But in any case, you need to have the president immediately on the phone with President Putin to say, look, we're getting reports. I can't tell you with 100% certainty that they're true, but we're getting very credible reports that your people are targeting our people. This has to stop now, or there will be significant consequences. We are watching this space very, very closely. Do not test me. If that message is given clearly and forcefully, then at a minimum, you give it a little bit of time to make sure to verify whether the activity has stopped or not. It's possible that that alone could have an effect. But then I would follow it up as well with once the intelligence is, once there's corroboration of the intelligence, you follow it up with additional steps. They could be sanctions. They should be, in fact, asymmetric. I don't think we want to get into a proxy war. By the way, this is an interesting point. Think about how exposed Russian service members are around the world. We could easily be paying extremists to put bounties on Russian lives in Syria.
But you're saying we shouldn't do something like that, though.
We should not, under any circumstances, do something like that. But we should impose costs. And, it could be sanctions. It could be restrictions on Russian companies' access to world markets. It could be additional asset freezes. There's a range of options. And as the corroborating intelligence flows in, I would advise, if I were in a position where my voice were being heard, to sort of proceed gradually on a list of such actions to show that this is serious and that we mean business. But the very first thing that should have happened is communication. And we know that President Trump spoke with President Putin at least 6 times since late March with zero mention of these bounties. And that's extremely troubling.
So this is, the perspective you're laying out here is it's a fairly hawkish perspective in some ways in thinking about the need for a robust response. Can you maybe say a little bit about how your views evolved at all? You've studied Russia for a lot of your professional career. You spent time in the last administration. How is your perspective on Russian foreign policy and what U.S. policy should look like? How has that evolved over the last several years?
Well, I think
I
think the fundamentals of my understanding of Russian foreign policy have not shifted dramatically. I think a lot of what I've been saying for the last several years has been borne out. I think Putin, by the way, the Putin we see today and the Putin we saw when he first came to power in 1999 and the year 2000, they're one and the same person. He's always looked up to KGB chief Yuri Andropov as his role model. He's always seen the disintegration of the USSR as the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century, and he's always seen the United States as geopolitical enemy number 1. But there is nevertheless a huge policy difference between Putin in the 2000s and the Putin we see today. The Putin in the 2000s, I think, wanted to work with the West, at least in order to secure Western direct investment and Western technologies in Russia. The Putin that we see today just wants to stick it to the West. He fears—
Is that because he thinks he doesn't need the West for economic purposes?
I think he thinks that he can make do with Chinese investments and with trade with China. I think he thinks he can divide the transatlantic community enough to be able to sell hydrocarbons and generate revenue without necessarily needing Western investments. And I think he really has come to fear the risk or the threat of Western democratic norms on his periphery and what that means for the stability of his own regime. So my thinking hasn't changed too much in that regard. Where I think, sometimes people hear a fairly hawkish prescription for policies in response to something as outrageous and as escalatory as bounties on American service members' lives. I think it's important to set, to frame that in a broader context where, a different administration that was pursuing a more consistent policy with Russia would, on the one hand, impose costs for egregious violations of either democratic sovereignty in terms of election interference or such things as placing bounties on American lives, but would balance that with, on the one hand, a dialogue on arms control, a desire for some sort of framework for preventing an arms race from occurring, and then also a more robust dialogue on how to maintain strategic stability that has components dedicated to arms control, but also components on risk reduction and crisis management, precisely in order to avert the problem of potential miscalculation, so that we are communicating, and this is where the Trump administration has failed miserably, because it is not communicating clearly to the Russian side what sorts of actions are unacceptable to us and that we see as particular infringements on our interests, and conversely, hearing from them what sorts of actions we may be taking that they regard as unacceptable from their side. And so, we could talk about Afghanistan and the bounties, but there's a lot of other bad stuff happening out there, like, aircraft buzzing each other within 10 feet. 10 feet is nothing when you're flying at, Mach 2 above the Baltic and Black Sea. And so that's why I think, a policy response that's tough has to be balanced with dialogue. But, and furthermore, and probably most importantly, has to be grounded in transatlantic unity, where we are on the same page with our democratic allies. And here's where, this administration has just, ripped the transatlantic relationship apart in any number of different ways, and where we are not on the same page with our allies. So unity, strength, dialogue, those are the operating principles. sometimes the strength, I think, gets overinterpreted, but it has to be grounded in all three.
So I'm going to come back to allies and partners, but I want to ask a question from the Q&A now that it's asking you. It's a little bit of a curveball. I was going to think a little bit differently about it. It says, I sympathize with your perspective, but from Russia's perspective, what should they do? NATO uses force, carves new nations out of Yugoslavia, nothing happens. Russia acts in similar ways and gets sanctions. How do we get Russia to trust an international system? What would you do if you were Russia?
Well, so I fundamentally disagree with the premise of the question, because there is no symmetry in terms of how the U.S. and its allies have behaved and how Russia has behaved more recently over the last 7 or 8 years. Russia invaded Georgia and continues to occupy 20% of its territory. Russia invaded Ukraine because Ukraine wanted to draw itself closer to the institutions of the European Union. And it forcibly annexed a chunk of its territory, swallowed it up, and then proceeded to occupy another 8 or 10% of its land in the Donbass. The U.S. has done nothing of the sort. You can criticize, and by the way, I'm a huge critic of the Bush administration's war in Iraq, which I think was disastrous. You can criticize the bombing of Kosovo. I think it was entirely appropriate to avert a genocide against the Kosovars. You can criticize the intervention in the Bosnian War in the mid-1990s, but those were fundamentally different. The U.S. did not swallow up a piece of Bosnia or a piece of Iraq for all the damage we did. And furthermore, we're not putting bounties, as I mentioned earlier, on Russian soldiers' lives. So we're not assassinating dissidents in foreign countries using a chemical nerve agent. So I appreciate the question, but these are not the same. These are not equivalent in any way, shape, or form. And yes, I think it's important to understand the Kremlin's concerns. I think their chief concern is fear of what they call color revolutions, and that's the same fear the Chinese have. And that causes a lot of their aggression because they think the best defense is a good offense. But it's important to understand that analytically, but that's not the same as tolerating that sort of aggressive behavior and expecting that it's all a wash because we've done some bad things in the past ourselves.
So it's now the third time I think that China's come up, and so it's a good time for a question in the Q&A that gets to that. It says, is the change in Russian foreign policy also a reflection of the transformation of the global political climate? Not only the rise of China, but the disunity of Western states. And a couple of other questions in the Q&A have asked about sort of China's role here and about Russo-Sino relations. So could you maybe say a little bit more about how you think that's factoring in? And then maybe there are two angles in particular I'd be sort of curious about. One, how does a rising China influence Putin's strategy? And then the other side of that being two, what's Putin's backup plan if things go south with China?
Yeah, great questions. So what I see when you really zoom out from Bounties and Afghanistan and what's happening inside Russia, and by the way, we haven't talked about the plebiscite that occurred on July 1st. Right. That's very much part and parcel of what we see going on is a desire to really entrench the regime in power. But if you zoom out from all that and you look at the international system writ large, and I know this is a lot of the work you do, Mike, from my perspective, you really see a growing competition, sometimes conflict, between liberal democracies on the one hand and authoritarian oligarchies on the other. And in some areas, there's a lot of concerted action by authoritarian states. In others, there is less of it. But I think the trend line is unmistakable. I think you're finding more collaboration amongst groupings of authoritarian powers. It's not always linear, but you do see it happening more and more. And you also see more disunity now, particularly, I would argue, in the last 3.5 years among the Democratic camp. And I fear that, Trump's disregard for our allies, both in Europe, calling the EU our #1 foe, worse than China, he's called it, attacking German Chancellor Merkel, Emmanuel Macron, and other European leaders. The EPP president, European People's Party president Donald Tusk says, with friends like that, who needs enemies? He's right. We have allowed for a lot of disunity to creep into the Democratic camp, and that has given authoritarian powers, including China, more space and more room to assert their influence, to increase their intervention in foreign countries like Afghanistan. But also you could cite Libya as an example where really the Russians have ramped up their presence tremendously just in the last year. We can talk about China's growing economic influence through Belt and Road and other mechanisms. But that's the story that we're seeing. We're seeing the increasing influence of authoritarian oligarchies, and that's what they have in common. They're authoritarian, and they concentrate economic resources in the hands of a narrow oligarchy. And I think both are equally important for understanding their behavior, and especially their economic relations with their peripheries. And so in terms of the Russia-Chinese nexus, which is the next question you asked, and can Russia count on China forever? Might this fall apart? I think it's a very fraught relationship. I think we've seen something that's approaching an alliance, not an explicit alliance, but very close. They both fear color revolutions. They both want to control their populations using maximal tools of authoritarian repression and technology. And they're sharing that technology to monitor the movements of their citizens. And they both have an interest in undermining the West, albeit with different MOs. The Russian Military Intelligence Agency, or GRU, is much more sort of kinetically inclined, more likely to carry out assassinations to sort of break glass, if you will, whereas the Chinese are a little bit more subtle, prefer to engage in the acquisition of distressed assets, corrupt influence over foreign governments, especially in places like the Balkans or Central Asia or Southeast Asia. And so you find slightly different sort of strengths and asymmetric toolkits being deployed, but very similar strategies. Now, the Russians understand, I'm sorry, this is a bit of a long answer, but yes, so I'm going to wrap up soon. But in terms of the relationship between Russia and China, and could that go south? I think that, the Russians increasingly understand, and maybe they've understood all along, that the Chinese pose a long-term threat. And you've seen a number of arrests recently of, for example, an employee of the Russian rocket space and rocket industry being arrested for passing secrets to the Chinese. The Russians understand the Chinese are a threat, but like most politicians, Putin is focused on the next 5 years, the next 3 years, maybe even more so. And so the Chinese are, they're a 10, 15, 20-year threat. That is understood, that is comprehended, but it is not immediate. And so politicians like Putin, by their nature, tend to focus on the near term. And so I think they've neglected a lot of that long-term strategic competition, but you occasionally see flashes of it.
So he thinks about the near term, but he's been focused a little on the long term, and at least in terms of trying to stay in power. You referenced the plebiscite. He's extending his tenure to, I think, 2034. So what does that mean for how the U.S. should be thinking about dealing with Putin, as he is sort of transformed before our eyes over the decades from a, maybe kind of sketchy former KGB president who would leave office and, leave power in a normal democratic transition, to someone who it increasingly seems will rule Russia, until he passes away?
Well, I think it would have been very hazardous for U.S. administrations in the past to have thought that Putin might be on his way out. He has demonstrated staying power since the mid-2000s, when he really was able to consolidate control of Russia, and especially the fissiparous tendencies in the regions, and also the sort of the unruly oligarchs that he really brought to heel by around, say, roughly 2005. He's really had a firm grip ever since then. And now, of course, with the plebiscite, he's constitutionally enabled to stay in power, actually till 2036. So, you know, a very long time. But this should have been a constant in U.S. strategic thinking, is assuming that Putin will remain in power. And I would even go a step further, Mike. I would say this: assuming that Putin is healthy until 2036, I think people should brace for the fact that whoever succeeds Putin, whether it's in 2036 or whether it's sooner than that,
oh no,
going to have largely the same foreign policy mindset as Vladimir Putin. I think they're going to see the U.S. as their number one geopolitical enemy. I think they're going to see color revolutions as a threat to their grip on power. And so the foreign policy, you know, there may be nuances, but I think it's largely going to remain constant. So we need to plan for the long term with Russia.
That's cheery.
One silver lining, maybe a little cheerier, a little more optimistic. You look at the opinion polling with younger Russians, and by younger I mean, you know, 15 to 25. Okay. Sort of late high school, early college, early you know, professionals.
Just like me, you know.
Like us, yeah, absolutely. If you ask them about, you know, Russia's occupation of Crimea or whether NATO is a threat, they're going to say occupation of Crimea is absolutely warranted. It's legitimate. NATO is a threat. Expansion has been horrible. The West is, you know, all of that geopolitical argumentation they have bought into. You're not going to change their minds on that if you engage in arguments. But if you probe in terms of their values, they tend to have pretty pro-Western values, by which I mean they really value creativity, individualism, entrepreneurship, rule of law. Striking number, about 45% would like to move to a Western country permanently. They'd like to leave Russia and they'd like to move to a Western country. Germany, I think, is at the top of the list, but the US is pretty up there too. And so is this younger generation that if we ignore them, we do so at our own peril. If we engage them more creatively, not with content that says, you know, NATO is good, you know, what you're doing is bad, that tends to play into the sort of the besieged fortress mentality that Putin and other propagandists have been pushing for so many, successfully for so many years. But if we engage them more creatively, there is some scope for potentially a little bit more optimism. But in the near term, I think we have to expect more of the same.
So we've danced around the question of America's allies and partners, and so I want to go there and ask, you know, what you know, as you know, you sort of made the case that the Trump administration has been, say, not the best friend of America's traditional allies and partners. What impact do you think that's had on Putin's behavior, seeing that lack of unity? And what could the U.S. do to improve things?
Yeah, I think this is crucial. Both Putin and Xi fear a united transatlantic alliance that leads the world's democracies to oppose their authoritarian influence more than anything. This is the nightmare scenario for both of them. Flip side of that is that disunity in the allied camp is like manna from heaven. It's a gift. And when they see, you know, President Trump saying things like the U.S. may not come to the defense of delinquent allies, or there was a riff that he had about Montenegro where the Montenegrins are, and I'm paraphrasing the president, are aggressive people, and so we may not defend them in the event of a crisis. Those sort of questions about the credibility of our Article 5 commitments to collective defense are music to Putin's ears, and Xi's ears too, because this creates doubts on the part of allies as to the dependability of the United States, and it leads some to consider hedging their bets with more cooperative or appeasement-like approaches towards Russia, and that is very, very dangerous. And so, you know, I can't underscore enough how important it is to maintain unity amongst our democratic allies, and particularly within NATO, to push back against these sorts of actions, whether it's bounties in Afghanistan, which have targeted our NATO allies as well as the US, or whether it's, you know, these assassinations of officials in places like Berlin or Salisbury. The responses have been rather weak. They've been diplomatic responses, the expulsion of a few Russian diplomats in both cases, which have predictably resulted in Russia expelling Western diplomats in response, sort of with a net zero effect. That sort of fairly weak, albeit unified response, it has not been enough. And then, you know, the fissures within NATO have really grown in recent years. And I mentioned Trump's statements, but you also have to factor in Hungary and Turkey's growing geopolitical alignments with Moscow. And I don't think NATO's ever been this divided before. Not since the Washington Treaty of 1949 have we seen such stark divisions within the alliance. And that's really a gift to any authoritarian that wants to run amok, either in the NATO space or elsewhere, like Afghanistan or Ukraine or Georgia.
So moving beyond NATO in particular, you know, when we think about allies and partners, who might be some, you know, for the audience here, who might be some unexpected maybe allies and partners or countries that the U.S. should be thinking about? You know, imagine a U.S. sort of thinking more about, you know, how do we build a coalition and you know, to handle Russia's aggressive behavior. You know, outside of NATO, who are other countries, maybe countries people might not be, you know, necessarily thinking about, that could be important allies in that effort?
Yeah, I think the key rests in an alliance of democratic states. And NATO has to be the foundation when you're thinking about deterrence against Russia. But if you're thinking more broadly about Russia and China and Iran and North Korea and Venezuela and the sorts of active measures, operations that they take to subvert democracies from the inside, there's much more scope for collaboration among a wider pool of democratic states that would include our East Asian allies, especially when, you know, you factor in that a lot of what China's doing is quite similar to what the Russians are doing on their periphery. We should be bringing in the Australians, the New Zealanders, the Japanese, the South Koreans, the Taiwanese, even the Vietnamese, and some other, the Indians. You know, the Indians are now engaged in a very serious clash with China in the Himalayas. And work with Israel, which shares many of our interests in, at least in its immediate neighborhood. And then in Latin America, a number of democratic states that we could work with to counter this sort of malign influence. When you broaden the aperture and you bring in more partners, you're able to do more. You're able to share intelligence, share best practices, and plug vulnerabilities through which regimes like Russia and China abuse, say, illicit finance to target democracies.
So we've spent almost 45 minutes, you know, going through this, and I now want to turn to, in some ways, the, you know, no pun intended, elephant in the room, and that being the president himself, and the, you know, the bromance part of the title of the, you know, of the event. And, you know, there have been, I would say, probably 10 questions in the Q&A that are variants of why is Trump not acting? So why don't we maybe get your perception of that as a top line, and then I have a couple follow-ups about the, you know, specifics of the bounty incident.
Yeah, well, so here are my thoughts, and I think at this point we really need to focus on Trump's behavior and what he says as well, but primarily his behavior. What Trump has done in response to the bounties, what he's done in response to Russia's interference in the 2016 election, has been consistently advancing the Kremlin's aims. When he stood alongside Vladimir Putin in Helsinki and said that Putin's denials have been strong and powerful, knowing full well that his own intelligence community thinks that's nonsense, he has shown a consistent ability to strengthen Putin's interests vis-a-vis the United States. And so you can make any kind of inferences you want, talk about a Manchurian president, this or that. The bottom line is that so many times, repeatedly, the U.S. has sold out our strategic interests to the Kremlin. And the areas where some have pointed to strength, when you look more closely, they turned out to be pretty hollow. So early on in the administration, a lot of proponents of Trump is strong on Russia pointed to his airstrikes in Syria, where we gave the Russians advance warning that we were going to conduct airstrikes on a few empty airfields, which had Syrian planes taking off, or Russian planes, I should say, excuse me, taking off within 24 hours of those strikes, or maybe it was 48 hours. So very inconsequential, more symbolic type action. Other people point to the fact that we provided Javelin missiles to Ukraine, which coincidentally in time happened exactly at the same time that Ukraine dropped investigations into Paul Manafort. I think there's a consistent pattern here, and I don't know that there was I don't think that Mueller did a very thorough investigation, and I think in retrospect he should have subpoenaed a statement from the president. That's come and gone. We'll never find out exactly what the nature of the communications between the 2016 Trump campaign and the Kremlin insider milieu really was. But we know one thing. We know one thing, that whether they acted with knowledge of what the other side was doing, they acted in concert to achieve the same ends, to disrupt the presidential campaign through the outing of doxed materials, and through a massive social media and information warfare effort on the part of the Russians to sow divisions within American society. So at the end of the day, I know as well as any of the listeners that are on today what actually happened. I do know that there's a clear pattern of a confluence of activity that supports where the Trump administration supports what the Kremlin wants and vice versa. And that to me is that's the most important thing. And it undermines our interests.
So let me ask a follow-up related to your time on the NSC staff, and that part of the political, we've been talking about I think the substance of the issue in some ways, but some of the political back and forth has revolved around the question of whether Trump was briefed and when. From your time on the NSC staff, is this the kind of thing the president often gets sort of briefed about? How should we be thinking about that?
Yeah, so I worked for over a year on the NSC staff as a director for Russia, and then I worked in the White House for a subsequent almost 2 years as a foreign policy advisor to Vice President Biden. And I had access to the PDB, and I can tell you that had there been intelligence indicating that the Russians were paying bounties for the killing of American service members, even if it was low confidence, and in this case we know it's medium confidence, the national security advisor would have walked into the Oval Office immediately upon reading that memo to notify the president, saying, look, at a minimum you have to be aware of this. We will convene a series of interagency meetings to propose options for you by next week or by tomorrow, maybe even. But in the meantime, you need to know that this is happening. And, I think Susan Rice published a pretty powerful op-ed in the New York Times saying that, if this had happened on her watch, that's exactly what she would have done. That's certainly in keeping with all the sort of crises that happened when I was working in the White House. That's exactly how we would have approached this. It's inconceivable that no one would have alerted the president. And then, given the fact that American lives are at stake, Secretary of Defense should have been all over this. Where was Secretary Esper? he should have, at a minimum, be clamoring for what's called a principals meeting, which is a meeting of the cabinet secretaries of all the national security agencies to discuss policy responses, and then moving it up to the president immediately thereafter with a series of graduated options for decision. That's what would have happened on our watch.
So, a question, sort of a follow-up that actually transitions a little bit to, what if it was your watch in the future? So, imagine there was a future administration. How would it succeed, maybe, where we've tended to think that maybe some other administrations haven't been as successful? And I would say both broadly in dealing with Russia, and specifically in thinking about the sort of various varieties of Russian occupation now. And is there a possibility, essentially, in a future administration to roll back the clock if we get Russia policy right in thinking about sort of Russia's occupation of Donbass, elsewhere, or are we going to need to think about those things sort of they're done and we move on from there?
Yeah, no, I don't think we need to think about things like the occupation of Donbass is done and we move on. Anytime a country violates the very bedrock principle of the international order, which is to invade, go across another international border into another sovereign country and occupy its land and start shooting its citizens, there has to be a strong response. You cannot ever say, well, what's done is done. It is just so egregious a violation of norms that it invites more of the same in the future. And I think there is a pattern going back to the invasion of Georgia. The lack of a strong response to the invasion of Georgia in 2008, I think in some ways fueled the invasion of Ukraine in 2014 and subsequent Russian malign behavior. And I think the Bush administration, frankly, bears a lot of the blame for the failure to respond to Georgia. I know a lot of that is often put on Obama, but the Georgia war was in August 2008. There were about 5 months there where the Bush administration did absolutely nothing, no consideration of sanctions. And I worked in that administration. I worked on Georgia at the time. We raised the issue of sanctions. We were told by the White House, this is not even close to being an option. And so when you think about, what would a future administration do, especially on an issue like, the placement of bounties on the lives of American service members, you have to look at it holistically. You can't just say, well, here's what we would do in this one instance. It really has to be, well, what is the broader strategy that would be implemented in that instance? And the broader strategy would be, I think, built on several pillars, as I mentioned before. I didn't flesh all of them out, so let me try to flesh them out. 4 key pillars here.
Okay.
One has to be strengthening consistently deterrence and defense capabilities within the NATO alliance to show that as Russia becomes more aggressive, NATO becomes stronger and more resilient and more capable of defeating Russian aggression should it ever occur against a NATO member state. And Russia doesn't like when NATO puts forces into the eastern flank countries or moves artillery capabilities into places like Poland or the Baltic states. But that's precisely one of the costs that it needs to face as a result of its aggression, is that sort of enhancement of posture within NATO. Second, as I mentioned already, there has to be a concerted, unified strategy of imposing costs. Doesn't mean that the EU needs to match the US step for step and do exactly what the US does each and every case, or vice versa. But when the Russian government is deemed responsible for the killing of a German citizen in Berlin, or if the Russian government is deemed responsible for a cyber operation in the United States, there has to be a unified response that imposes serious costs, not just the expulsion of a few diplomats, but something serious that changes the cost-benefit calculus for the Kremlin. Third, we really have to work to build the resilience of both NATO members, but also importantly our partner states like Georgia and Ukraine to Russian subversive measures. And there's, we're doing training in Ukraine right now we actually have US boots on the ground in Ukraine, and it's a big deal. training their soft forces and training their conventional land forces as well. And we need to be doing more of that, frankly, across the region to beef up capabilities against Russian subversion, and also to demonstrate, again, there's a cost, there's a reaction to what the Kremlin does. You're not going to just get away with this with no response whatsoever. And then finally, as I mentioned, maybe the more positive element to this, enhanced dialogue. There really isn't a strategic stability dialogue today, at least not one between interlocutors on the two sides who are in positions of power to actually make.
So we got to talk even if we disagree.
We got to talk even if we disagree, and it can't be a pro forma dialogue. It can't be an occasional presidential phone call. It can't be just the Secretary of State talking to Sergei Lavrov every now and then. It has to be, I like, for strategic stability, for example, on that topic, I like the 2+2 format of foreign and defense ministers meeting with their counterparts, maybe also with national security advisors, to really talk through the issues in a meaningful, substantive way. And then also to pursue, as I mentioned, risk reduction and arms control to sort of prevent the conflict from ever getting out of control. Those are the four pillars. And so, a response to a specific incident has to be embedded within sort of a broader approach built on those four pillars.
So it's not just about the policy in response to this, policy in response to that, but it's part of a more coherent strategy.
Yeah, if it's all in a vacuum and it's not, the left hand is not cognizant of what the right hand is doing, it's muddled and we misread each other and we invite further escalation and also miscalculation.
So, last question before we get you out of here. I want to ask a question related to a lot of the events that we've been doing over the last several months. Since we went virtual, have had to do with the coronavirus pandemic, and since that's why we're virtual. And there have been a lot of reports of the pandemic, the size of the case count in Russia growing. Of course, the case count has grown significantly in the United States. Could that throw a curveball in U.S. Russian relations? How might sort of escalating costs due to coronavirus influence some of this U.S. Russian interaction on the world stage?
Yeah, that's a great question. On the one hand, I'm a little hesitant to make some of these grand pronouncements that I've seen sort of other foreign policy pundits make, that the coronavirus is changing the whole distribution of power in the international system. I think a lot of that is frankly overblown. But I will say this, it's not just the coronavirus pandemic in Russia, but it's that coupled with the historically low oil prices that are creating a real economic crunch for Russia over the next couple of years. And yes, Russia has $530 billion. That's a lot of money in reserves distributed across its sovereign wealth funds and other funds. Russia is going to be in for a world of hurt economically. Incomes, real disposable incomes will fall. And that has historically led the Kremlin to foreign adventurism. So I think the likelihood of more adventurism, more sort of escalatory behavior is quite high in the next few years. And by the same token, I think one of the things that led to this whole situation where the Kremlin decided to go on offense against the West dates back, actually, I said 2012 was a pivotal year when Putin came back to power. But, a few years before that, we had the financial crisis of 08-09. And I think it was really important in the Kremlin's mindset that Western powers were not as invincible and as powerful as they thought. Boy, if they thought that then, with the housing bubble and the crisis that we experienced then, what are they going to think now about this rampant, coronavirus crisis in the U.S., which we just can't, this administration can't control, and really exposes so many weaknesses and divisions in our society, weaknesses and divisions that the Kremlin would love to amplify and exacerbate. So all of that, I think, bodes for a continuation of this covert war between Russia and the U.S., even if Corona in itself is not going to be the thing that completely redistributes power across the international system. As I said, I think that is it's probably a step too far.
Well, we're about out of time, so I hope everyone will join me in thanking Dr. Michael Carpenter, the managing director of the Penn Biden Center, for a really interesting conversation about U.S. Russia relations. It's been a pleasure to partner with the Penn Biden Center on this event, like all the times when we team up, and we hope you'll come back to join us for an event in the future.
I'd love to. Thanks, Mike.
And I hope for everybody listening, I hope you'll join us for our last World Today of the summer before we take a brief break for the fall. It'll be on nursing and COVID-19, perspectives from the U.S. and Latin America on July 21st at 12 p.m. You can find that on our website. We hope you'll register and join us to learn about how what's going on in the U.S. and Latin America with regard to COVID and the role the nursing profession is playing. So thanks a lot for joining, everybody, and have a great day.
Thanks. Bye.